Thank you so much, Mitsikunuksaya, for your courage, your leadership, and your resilience in fighting for freedom and democracy in Belarus and beyond. You've truly been an inspiration to all of us here at the Council and beyond. And it's in this spirit that I'm now honored to welcome our next panel, Reporters at Risk, Supporting Truth Tellers in an Age of Rising Authoritarianism. For those just now joining, my name is Jenna Ben-Yehuda, and I'm the Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council. Over the past year, the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht National Security Resilience Initiative within our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security has led an ongoing event series, Reporters at Risk. It works to raise awareness of the risks that journalists face around the world and the importance of bolstering press resilience in an increasingly fraught global reporting landscape. The Atlantic Council started this series to support the campaign to free Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, following his imprisonment in Russia on false charges of espionage. Over the past few months, we've worked closely with the Wall Street Journal and in partnership with media organizations from NBC to CNN to elevate Evan's story and the stories of detained and at-risk journalists all around the world who face a similar plight. We're so grateful that Evan, along with Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty journalist Alsu Kurmasheva, who was also detained in Russia, is now free, following an August 1st prisoner exchange in Ankara. But the work to protect reporters at risk around the world is far from over. Across the globe, press freedom and security are under assault amid authoritarian crackdowns on free speech and dissent. And according to Reporters Without Borders, in 2024, as global democracy levels have hit their lowest point in nearly 2 decades, political obstruction of journalists and their work remains on the rise. Over 85% of detained journalists around the world are held by authoritarian regimes, with China, Belarus, and Russia among the top jailers of journalists. But beyond imprisonment, thousands of journalists operating in hostile media environments, from local reporters to international correspondents, experience harassment for their work. That includes government censorship by repressive regimes and threats to their safety, and in some cases, to their lives. Today, we welcome an extraordinary group of journalists, all with firsthand experience reporting in authoritarian countries, including Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, to discuss what it is like to report under these circumstances. In today's conversation, we hope to shed light on the unique challenges that journalists who cover some of the world's most closed societies face, discuss the tools and tactics for building press resilience, and explore the role of the free press, a fundamental pillar of democracy, and countering authoritarianism now and in the future. With that, I will turn to Jane Ferguson, author and correspondent at PBS NewsHour, to moderate our conversation. Jane, over to you.
Thank you, Jenna, for those incredible words. And I think that, just really making reference to what you have said about the incredible threat, not just to democracy, but the threat that to democracy, that it's effectively going hand in hand right now with threats to journalists. The fact that 85% of journalists who are being held by authoritarian regimes is really extraordinary at the moment. We are incredibly lucky to have a remarkable panel here. Our guests are really quite extraordinary and have worked under some of the most repressive regimes in terms of press freedoms, and are very much so on the coalface day to day with those authoritarian regimes. Really today, I look back at some of the places that I've been lucky enough to report from, and I've seen firsthand an extraordinary decline in press freedoms, a repression that was always there of local journalists in many of the places us foreign correspondents work in, but an increasing repression of international reporters as well. You know, I've worked in Afghanistan for years, where now, of course, we see under the Taliban regime, journalists jailed and beaten, especially those covering issues around women's rights. I was in Egypt during the military coup in 2013, where we saw an incredible crackdown on journalists. We see journalists today, you know, as we've mentioned, in part of this incredible series that the Atlantic Council has been having. We've also seen, of course, Evan Gershkovich wrongly imprisoned in Russia for many, many months. And even just recently, we've seen the Al Jazeera bureau in Ramallah forcibly closed at gunpoint just in recent days. This couldn't be a more important topic to discuss today, so I'm just so happy to have this incredible team here of panelists who I'm going to introduce. Of course, Jason Rezaian, writer on global opinions, a former Tehran bureau chief for the Washington Post. We also have Edward Wong here, and diplomatic correspondent, former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times, author of At the Edge of Empire, A Family's Reckoning with China, which came out just this June. It actually has sections on Xi Jinping's crackdown on press and freedoms, freedom of speech in China. And Mikhail Zygar, founding editor-in-chief of TV Rain, non-resident fellow here at the Atlantic Council. You can read his work on Substack and his newsletter, The Last Pioneer. And we're also incredibly lucky to be joined by Jean Lee. She is joining us obviously virtually here, co-host of The Lazarus Heist on BBC World Service. She's former Pyongyang bureau chief for the Associated Press. So in these four people, we have an incredible amount of geography that covers authoritarian regimes that make it increasingly difficult, almost impossible, for journalists to work. So this is an incredible brain trust, and I'm very grateful to be able to sit with you four. I'd like to open by diving straight into an issue that I think everybody has very much on the forefront of their minds in this highly technological era, where we really have an incredible capability for regimes and dictatorships to spy on reporters as well as their sources, those who you'd want to talk to, those you associate with. How do you, in your current work, and I'd like to open by going to you, Mikhail. You are a Russian journalist based in New York City. You write for global audiences in English, but also in Russian as well. You're covering a regime that is increasingly repressive of reporters, and their technological ability to do that is it highly advanced? How do you get around that? How do you talk to sources?
Sometimes it seems to me that their technological abilities are a bit exaggerated. So yes, we still have a lot of possibilities to talk to the sources from those locations where we cannot go. I cannot travel, obviously, back to Russia because I'm sentenced to 8.5 years in absentia. But I still can talk to all of my sources. We have a lot of reliable messengers. For most Russians, Telegram used to be the reliable one, and now no one trusts it. No one uses it any longer. But for example, Signal is the reliable source of reliable platform to talk to people, including Russian bureaucrats, including Russian member of government. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's still possible to talk. A lot of people are, I would say, a lot of people in all those countries feel paranoid because, and they are right, because sometimes when you think that you are being spied on, that doesn't mean only that they could publish the transcript of your conversation. That means that you can be the target. And for us, for Russian journalists in exile, we obviously should not use, it's basics, but we know that we should not use any geolocation in our phones. We should not reveal our location on a daily basis, because we should not use delivery, for example, because if we disclose our address, the delivery person could bring us Novichok or something else. So it's not only about the privacy and about the vulnerability of the information you're sharing. That's about the safety and about matter of life.
It's interesting, though, what you say about how we can overestimate and overstate the technological capabilities, in which point, like, do you think that there is a sense of almost a psychological element there to trying to dissuade people from talking to reporters? There's a sense that they want people to overestimate what they can do.
I'm sure. For example, I guess that my prison sentence was, in a way, a threat not to me. It was kind of a warning to my sources, and they wanted to discourage my sources from communication with me. And a lot of things they do, they threaten much more. We don't see a lot of Russian journalists being killed. We saw a couple of cases of unsuccessful poisonings, but unsuccessful poisoning is still a poisoning, and everyone knows about that, and everyone starts watching the food and the people who come and go.
Yeah. And Edward, I'd love to put this question to you. I mean, you've worked in China, and you cover also many other dictatorships. But in terms of your work, how do you protect your information, protect yourself and your sources?
I think the difficult thing about China is that essentially they've created their own intranet. Like China, I think, is one of the prime examples in the world where there's a completely bifurcated electronic system. So there's a couple, and when journalists go into China, not the ones who are based there, but ones who visit China occasionally, like I do. I used to be based there. I go back every now and then, including last year. Then you have to take certain practices. One is that you don't take any of your regular electronic devices with you. So similar to the measures that the US government takes, the recommendations for journalists entering China are to bring in burner phones and laptops and just dispose of get rid of those, hand them back to your security people once you leave China, on the assumption that they've been infected with some sort of malware that will collect your information. I think the trickiest thing is how to get in touch with sources, because essentially every Chinese person relies on an app called WeChat or Weixin to communicate with each other and with the outside world. I've used it before, but the problem is that we know for a fact that security agencies can instantly get messages from that app and track what you're doing with your sources. Plus, they can take chats from that app and use as evidence in trials or other things if they ever want to go after your sources. So the tricky thing is to try and contact sources, or only contact them in the most vague way using that app, and then figure out other ways of setting up meetings with them. It's very difficult. It's not easy to do. Oftentimes you have to pass messages through various routes to your sources. I do think, like Mikhail says, that there is also sometimes an overemphasis, though, on the technological capabilities. I do think that they have the ability, the Chinese government and the security agencies have the ability, when they want to closely track people within the country. But oftentimes, they're not investing the manpower into doing that. So for example, if I went to China now, I think I could reasonably contact sources, meet with them, travel around the country to most places, without being followed by the security agencies and having that meeting disrupted before it takes place. But the thing is, once, in retrospect, when your story comes out, then they might track down the people and then question them, sometimes detain them or imprison them or put them on trial.
Which is pretty old-fashioned. I mean, that's how they would have, how many dictatorships would have done it 20, 30 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
And I just think that they're not keeping that close tabs yet on every single journalist that comes into China or that works there. If they feel you're about to break a story that is very sensitive, they might put those eyes on you But until then, I think you still have some leeway to work within the country.
Thank you. Jean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in terms of being able to get in touch with sources, protect sources, and any kind of sense that there is more or an increasing amount of the ability to spy. I mean, Mikhail has mentioned also, the idea that Telegram isn't safe anymore. I remember years ago the sort of realization that WhatsApp wasn't. It seems sort of almost hilariously naive now to think that you could talk to sources on WhatsApp, but it used to be, like certainly during the Arab Spring and a lot of the revolutions, that people were using WhatsApp, which has obviously not been secure for a long time. But for you yourself, like trying to talk to sources, or for journalists trying to operate in areas where they're under surveillance, have you seen any changes in terms of how they use technology?
Well, before we get to the changes, I just want to say that in some ways, hearing Ed speak, when I would leave Pyongyang and get to China, I would think, thank God I'm back in the semi-free world. Because when you're an American and you're an American journalist in Pyongyang, you are the only one, trust me, they are allocating resources to keep track of you. So I was under complete surveillance at all times. And I have to say, as a journalist, as an American, I was not prepared for that. We didn't grow up in a country where we had to think and worry about everything we say and do. That did mean, like the journalists have mentioned, the fellow panelists, I had separate identities, separate computers, separate technologies, multiple identities for when I went into China and North Korea to keep not only myself secure, but to keep my networks secure. Now, going back to what you're saying about how things have changed, I do think the North Koreans have invested in technology. This is the focus of my work right now. It is part of a broader strategy that is built around using technology to raise illicit funds for the weapons program, but also there is a cyber espionage campaign, and people like me and my colleagues, experts, journalists, are the target of this right now. I can't tell you, I spend a good chunk of my day trying to warn people against the cyber espionage that we are the target of right now. Sometimes people will say to me, well, I have nothing to hide, and I will have to remind them, it's not just you that you have to worry about, but it's your entire network if they can get into your computer and expose everybody that you've been in touch with. So those are risks that they're very clear when you're on the ground in North Korea. You can see it because they go straight into your computer. But it's also a risk when you're outside the country. We are all at risk of that right now.
I'm really keen to follow up on that, Jean. Like, that to me, just as a former foreign correspondent, feels like an extraordinary amount of pressure. How do you remain resilient? I mean, resilience is a huge part of what we want to talk about here today in terms of reporting. I mean, the pressures and the amount of just the very basic ability to operate day to day and maintain a constant sense of brain power attached to being mindful of your identities, of your own devices, of people that could be targeting you and your sources. I mean, can you talk a little bit about how you cope effectively with that level of pressure doing the job?
I do think that coverage of North Korea does get neglected when it comes to preparing journalists, making sure they're resilient, not only preparing them to cover a story that is incredibly challenging, where if you don't speak the local dialect, you're not going to be able to speak to the local people, and also how to protect ourselves. And so that's an area I would encourage foundations, NGOs, groups that try to build resiliency to focus on making sure that not only are journalists able to effectively and resourcefully cover North Korea, but protect themselves. I think that we tend to overlook North Korea because it does seem like a country that is so disconnected. But in some ways, the threat is very real on the ground. It may not be active warfare, it may not be conflict, bombs, bullets, but the psychological warfare is very real. I would say that it took me at least 2 years after I left North Korea to be able to even sit through a meal without being antsy. I'm sure some of my fellow panelists can talk about the effect of that kind of surveillance, that kind of pressure that has on you psychologically. And that kind of preparation, it's trauma reporting. That kind of preparation and resilience training is absolutely necessary for reporting in authoritarian countries.
Thank you, Jean. Heading on to our next question, which Jason, I'd love to talk to you about really in particular, is really kind of looking ahead. The situation is not getting better. I mean, we've heard, of course, at the top of this conversation about effectively, an incredible amount of black holes that are effectively popping up, because the reality is a lot of this crackdown on reporting is working. I think about places, of course, like Afghanistan, but there are other parts of the world where there have been, we were just talking about this before we came up here, that have been black holes for quite some time. But looking ahead, I mean, Jason, your experiences obviously in Iran and having been thrown in prison there, in the past, you have experienced firsthand more than most what the powers that can be effectively exacted upon journalists, very often with no repercussions.
Well, certainly.
Where do you think it's headed?
I think it's unfortunately bound to get worse. It's been 10 years since I was arrested in Tehran. On the same day that I had been given a 1-year extension of my press accreditation. My wife and I were arrested from our home. We were 2/5 of the English language international press in Tehran. At that point, it was already a very small group, and it's dwindled. It's down to almost nothing at this point. And so when we talk about the return and the prisoner swap that brought Evan Gershkovich and Alsu Kurmasheva back to freedom last month, I rejoice in that. I'm thrilled that they're able to get back to their lives, but I'm worried about the widening gap in coverage. China, Russia, Iran, but then also countries that used to be reliable democracies, the Philippines, India, a number of journalists who've been murdered in India and those murders gone unprosecuted is shocking, it's astounding. So I think we have to think long and hard about how are we going to fill these voids. One of the things that we were talking about earlier was the need to fold in local journalists into our international news gathering. Well, unfortunately, in many of those countries, those local journalists are now being forced into exile. I know many of them from Iran, people I used to work with on the ground, who are now here in the United States or in Europe looking for work, right? So I think that there's an opportunity, primarily because of the technology that we have available to us in terms of tools for reporting, digital and visual forensics, that the Post, the Times, and a growing number of news outlets are using, is a great opportunity for us, but we gotta get on this quick, because the number of places that we can adequately cover at this point is diminishing day by day.
Do you have, a sense of the kind of support reporters are going to need? It's a very different kind of reporting. If we think about being potentially outside a country or being in a country but being given no access to see things.
Well, that's the first. I'll take the second part first. I mean, is it worth it to go send our reporters to places that they can't really get around in? And I have my opinions about that, but I don't have a hard and true answer to that. But I think, these folks that are able to get out of the countries and continue to work now face real transnational repression. In the case of Iran, we've had multiple journalists subject of assassination attempts right here in New York City and in London, all in the last year. So we need to bolster the protection of our staffs in places like Pyongyang, Beijing, Russia, if they're able to go. For better or worse, nobody's going to Iran at this point. but also when those very vulnerable exiled journalists land on our shores, we need to do a better job of protecting them while in freedom.
Well, this couldn't be more relevant to you, Mikhail, of course, as someone who's living this right now. You know, I mean, in terms of, you know, the ability to, do you feel pessimistic about the ability to really support Russian journalists inside Russia? Is the best option right now to support those who are able to get out and trying to speak to not just a Western English-speaking audience, but also a Russian audience itself?
Now, on the one hand, I'm very optimistic because I'm sure that there is zero chance for Russia to become the black hole. We know what's happening there. We have so many people. You know, actually, the population of Russia is sabotaging Putin's policy because we have so many people watching and consuming the content of media in exile and contributing. We know that as much as 20% of approximately 20% of Russian population are actively denouncing the war, and the majority is just pretending that nothing is happening and are not enthusiastically consuming all the news, but that doesn't mean that they are supporting. They still need the information, and we do have a lot of little local independent media in different regions of Russia with very high level reporting of the local news. So we don't have mainstream media in Moscow to cover what's happening in Kremlin, but we have much more information about different regions of Russia and about the local, very important local news, much more than we used to have before the beginning of the invasion. And we could never expected that media in exile could be working so effectively and could learn so much from Russia and could be so popular domestically. Because I'll give you one example. This year? There was a huge terrorist attack in Moscow. The concert hall was attacked by ISIS terrorists. And that was a very interesting moment because a lot of people from Moscow wanted to watch what was happening. And the only TV channel to cover it live was TV Rain, which is broadcasting from Amsterdam. So the population of Moscow was watching TV channel broadcasting from Amsterdam to learn news from Moscow. Because none mainstream state-owned TV channel stopped their traditional reporting programming. Everyone was showing soap operas or reality shows. So it's important that we see that media in exile are still popular for the population. And yes, it's really dangerous for people. It's dangerous for people who work in Russia, but unfortunately we see that all the independent journalists who were writing or reporting about politics, they are out of the country.
And is that, the example for TV Rain covering that is fascinating. Is that because the Russian government cannot really stop people, or is it because they're just not inclined?
They have started trying to block Facebook recently. Before that, for more than 2 years through the war, YouTube was the most important source of platform for independent media. Actually, Telegram, which I labeled as unreliable, is still a very important source of information because news channels in Telegram is something where all Russians get news from. And it's a source of both unreliable and reliable information. So I guess technologically that's impossible for Russian authorities. Russia has never been like China. Russia has never reached and was never trying to reach that level of censorship and state control of internet. And I guess it's almost impossible because the population is sabotaging. Before that, when they blocked Facebook and Instagram during the first week of the invasion of Ukraine, a lot of people said, okay, we'll live without Facebook or Instagram. And now when they are blocking YouTube, the choice of most people is VPN. Okay, if we don't have, they are forcing us to use VPN so we could have broader access.
And interestingly, in doing so, they're effectively conditioning a population to just get used to getting around these things. This is how we get news now. We just ignore the government and go online. But Edward, I'd love to ask, you with regards to China. I mean, how does this differ from the, if you take what Mikhail is saying about the Russian population?
Yeah, I think what he points out, the difference between China and Russia is absolutely right. The level of technological control and censorship has been much greater in China, and they've been perfecting the system where they have this thing that we call the Great Firewall, which prevents Chinese citizens who are using Chinese servers to get to sites like the New York Times or Facebook. And partly it's to obviously suppress information that they don't want in the system. Partly it's to bolster their own companies, like their own social media companies, and make sure that American companies don't get market share in China. So, and what he says about Russians using VPN, actually only a very tiny percentage of Chinese use VPNs. I think that conditioning of getting people to go around hasn't really taken root in China. People will instead gravitate to the official sources of information or to these WeChat channels that they might have set up. But WeChat is also heavily censored, like the social media app that I mentioned is also heavily censored. So it's very, very difficult if you're in China, living there day to day, to get the information that you want unless you are a very active user with VPNs. I would say that, there used to be this quasi media in exile that people would go to, and that was essentially Hong Kong. Like Hong Kong used to be the place where there was Chinese language media, Chinese language news organizations that would be producing news and opinion that was somewhat critical or distanced from the Communist Party even after the handover had taken place in 1997. But with the crackdown that took place in Hong Kong in 2019 with the national security law, the implementation of this new national security law, and the wide and sweeping crackdown on liberal thinkers, on journalists, on media executives, then that's been quashed. A famous example that I mentioned in my book is Jimmy Lai, who was the publisher of Apple Daily. The Chinese government and Hong Kong government have decided to make an example of him. He's one of the most well-known critics of the Communist Party in Hong Kong. And very quickly, in 2019, soon after the protests were quashed, the Hong Kong authorities moved to arrest him and then intend on putting him on trial and eventually sentencing him. And so he's been named by, I think, the U.S. government as one of the people that the U.S. government would like to see released from Hong Kong. In China, there's a similar thing, the mainland China, PRC, there's a similar thing going on with the national security law in that Xi Jinping has decided to embolden national security agencies and saying that this is national security agencies, state security agencies need to look out for subversives, and he's put certain journalists into that category. So there's one example in China, a journalist whom I knew when I was working in China, someone named Yu Dong, who I think is the most prominent journalist now imprisoned in China. He's been charged with espionage. He was picked up around 3 years ago, and they are accusing him of espionage because he has met openly with Japanese diplomats and US diplomats, and essentially they're charging him with doing his job as a journalist. He's a journalist for a state news organization, not even sort of a quasi-market liberal organization, but a state news organization, party newspaper, and they've imprisoned him for that, and now he's awaiting a verdict. He and his family are awaiting a verdict and a sentencing in his case. And again, he's on the radar of certain US officials who are trying to speak out against this also.
Thank you. Jean, I'd love to sort of really kind of focus on this question in terms of North Korea as well. And I mean, Mikhail has talked a lot about how people in Russia are able to kind of get around some of the censorship, using the internet and technology, and of course in China the capabilities and the will to crack down on a more sort of pan scale across people, across the population is there, the ability to. But I wonder, if we look at this from the perspective also of economics, of, your average person who has a laptop and a VPN and a mobile phone and a Wi-Fi connection, has the ability more today to get around these censorships than they have in the past. But can you give us any kind of sense, and even your own personal experiences trying to reach audiences and other journalists trying to reach audiences in North Korea? I mean, is it utterly naive to think that that's possible? And how could anybody there possibly get around censorship and have a sense of what's being said in the outer world?
Yeah, laptop, internet, a VPN, that would be a dream for a North Korean. You talk about a black hole. I often show an image of North Korea from outer space. And you see the Korean peninsula shaped like a rabbit. The southern half of it is just bright and glowing. The northern half is black. And that's because the reality is, it is, despite the money that they're pouring into the nuclear program, despite the images that they show on their state media, it's one of the poorest countries in the world. People do not have electricity. For me, when I was in the countryside, when the sun set, that's it. You didn't see a light across the countryside at all. And so the reality is that the people are cut off because of their economic state. They don't have the electricity, they don't have the technology, the electricity comes on just long enough for them to watch the state media. Of course, radio broadcasts are something they can't control because the speakers are mounted, so they have to hear that propaganda that's being pumped through the speakers. Now, there are some people who do have access in the capital, but they need to have permission, and so the internet is extremely restricted. I would say that by going into North Korea, one of the roles that I played was to bring information into the country as well, and to be a conduit of information. So that is a role that journalists can play. It's not just about the information that I take out of the country, which is a lot, but it's also the information that I bring in. And I will say that in terms of being a black hole, we are deep into a black hole of information, because I think the last time American journal, maybe any foreign journalist, has been in North Korea was 2019. And someone can correct me if I'm mistaken, but that's, if that's the case, that's 5 years that we've had people on the ground, which means that North Korea sealed its borders, not just because of the COVID pandemic, but also to regain control of the flow of information in and out of the country, and to regain control over the narrative. They have forced us to rely on their state media for information. So, I took a quick look to see what was out there, and the news is based on what it is the North Koreans feed us. And so that is aimed at raising tensions. A lot of the imagery in the news that they put out is designed to raise tensions in the region, and that helps them justify pouring resources that they don't have into their illicit, illegal weapons program. And, I would say that by letting the North Korean regime direct our news coverage, news outlets are unwittingly helping to support that nuclear buildup. And that's at the expense of the hidden North Korean people, and at the expense of global security. So that is part of the reason we try to get on the ground. And I would be curious to hear what Jason thinks about this, because he raised that question of whether it is really useful to get people on the ground. I would say that all of us can probably attest to the fact that the story that you see when you're on the ground, when you're with the people, having conversations with them, taking in everything around you, the smells, the sounds, the sights, the gossip, the chatter, the jokes, that shapes your understanding of a place and the politics in a way that you can't get from the outside. But it is very dangerous. It is extremely dangerous as Americans to be operating in countries where we are unwelcome, where they see us as potential spies, and where we can't operate or circulate. In North Korea, you really, I used to joke that I couldn't go to the bathroom without permission, where you really cannot operate freely.
Thank you, Jean. And yeah, I'd love to turn to you now, Jason, to respond to her comments. I know that we've talked obviously at length about journalists and publishers being imprisoned. Obviously, Evan's case has really raised the importance of this. and I apologize to return to your experiences in jail in Iran, but I'd love to know your thoughts on both what Jean has raised there about getting on the ground, but also the cost of when it goes wrong and why it goes wrong. There's this sort of perception that, there's a random arresting of journalists, and I think that is a misconception that it's almost kind of random, and the decision making around when to pick up a journalist, sham trials, moving ahead with this. Could you speak to a little bit around the processes? Like, how do we get there?
So Jean is 100% right that there is no replacement for having people on the ground. Unfortunately, in many of these societies, the limitations that are put on journalists when they arrive, especially if they aren't folks like the four of us who speak the local language, know the customs, have deep experience in sourcing, it almost can border on stenography for the state if we're not careful about it. And on this question of journalists' arrest, I think there was this perception for a long time that, as journalists, we had sort of some protective layer around us. And when I was first working in Iran in the mid-2000s, I certainly felt that way. And when I was hired by the Washington Post in 2012, I definitely felt that way. There were many more times before I was hired from the Post where I thought I was under real threat of being arrested. I always knew and understood the risks that working in Iran came along with. I just didn't think it would happen when it did, right? I thought we had moved past that phase. And I think what my arrest was sort of a foreshadowing of in several of these countries, Iran, Russia as well. This is a move designed to astound the world, right? So our defense or our reaction to journalist arrests around the world has to change. The strongly worded condemnation from a US congressperson that might have worked 20 years ago is meaningless. I hate to say it, but that's the reality. They are arresting people to scare other journalists from doing the job, and the leverage that they might extract from the US government or another democracy in return for releasing an imprisoned journalist is just sort of the icing on the cake, right? So I think our tools of prevention and reaction have to evolve to respond to the nature of the problem.
Do you think governments should do more?
I think governments need to do more. I think news organizations need to be more prepared for this. This is not something that we should react to in a flat-footed way. We have enough case studies to know that this is a serial crime with lots of copycats. And I think the NGO community needs to evolve in how they respond to it. Lord knows that there are lots of resources being poured into press freedom domestically and internationally. And I think we have to do a better job of mobilizing those resources and preparing news organizations and journalists for the inevitable arrests of more colleagues in the short term.
Thank you. And I just to one last really quick question, Mikhail, I'd like to come to you on this because you mentioned that it is designed to shock the world. That's usually, in the end, an international journalist or a Western reporter or someone working for a Western, major American newspaper. I've always been very, very aware in my work, and I think everybody here feels the same, that local journalists face much, much higher risks of being arrested and sent to jail, and it barely even making the news. So I think that in terms of the ability to act and to do so more aggressively when a foreign correspondent has been arrested is something that is an increasingly important topic. But for local journalists like Mikhail, I'd love to hear just briefly how Russian reporters who are either on the ground or in exile like yourself feel about the future and just effectively any kind of sense that staying out of jail is almost an unlikely scenario for you if you continue to do your work?
I'll tell you a short story of a close friend who used to be a correspondent working for our TV channel. And he was the only one of all the staff of the TV channel who decided to stay and to stay in Moscow. And he continued reporting from all the trials, all the rallies. He was working at all of Navalny's trials, for example. He started collaborating with Novaya Gazeta, which was closed, but in a way the staff continued working because they're not supposed to be called newspaper. They are not media, but legally it's not forbidden to have a website if you are just a group of friends. Okay, we are not newspaper, we're making a website, and that's not news website, that's just a website. And they're still working till now, including Dmitry Muratov, who is Nobel Prize winner. He is still editor-in-chief and he is still in Moscow. And a friend of mine was working for that media, and he didn't want to leave. And one moment, we saw the process that Russian government started arresting every reporter who was reporting about Navalny's trials. That happened after Navalny's death, but still that was some kind of revenge to all the media who reported about him. The stringer who worked for Reuters was arrested, the stringer who worked for Associated Press, all of them Russian citizens were arrested. And the guy I'm talking about, he was the next to be arrested, and his editor-in-chief, Dmitry Muratov, was fast enough to buy him a ticket and to send him to Tbilisi, Georgia. He left Russia within an hour. The next day, police came to his apartment and they arrested his mother. And they accused her of supporting terrorism, and now she's in jail. She's also a journalist, but I'm 100% sure that was kind of revenge. Okay, you escaped, we're arresting your mother. So yeah, that's unimaginable. We could not imagine 3 years ago that was even possible. We were probably delusional, or at the same time we knew that their only idea is to hold that power, and now they start pretending that there is a hint of democracy. Yeah, they are going to kill, they are going to arrest everyone.
It's dropping that pretense. Thank you for that. We have time, I'm told, for one question from the audience. So I'd love to be able to sort of toss to anybody who wants to ask anybody specifically on the panel about a topic. Just raise your hand. All right, we got one there. Someone bringing you a microphone.
Oh.
Hi, I'm Michael Bazurkiw. I'm a senior fellow with the Eurasia Center, and I'm based in Odessa, a former journalist. It's interesting, you talked about technology being used by journalists, and I've used it myself, to evade detection by the authorities. But right now what we see happening in Ukraine is that technology is being used by the Russia to locate journalists. There was the recent sad killing of the Reuters staff member in eastern Ukraine, and I talked to security experts, and they said that the Russians triangulated the use of foreign SIM cards, sent a missile that way with tragic consequences. My question, though, is the following. We talked a lot about local journalists, and sadly that's what's happening in Ukraine. There are so many journalists that have just no means to work anymore, newsrooms have been destroyed or whatever. They're being forced into exile. And I'm wondering so now we'll have Belarusian journalists in exile, Russian ones in exile, and others, whether there's a way to help support more robustly these offshore newsrooms that they can still cover the country, and that we don't use that talent, we don't lose that talent of the local journalists. Thank you.
I think there is a way to this situation we're now living in is much better in a way. It's funny that I'm saying that, but it's so much better than the situation of journalists during the Cold War, for example. Because in the Soviet Union there was no free media, no free press, and the media in exile were really cut off from everything what was happening domestically. Now we have much more information, and Russian media in exile are really popular inside the country, and they matter. We know for sure that they matter for those people who live inside the country, as well as for out of Russia for millions of people who left Russia and are all around the world. We know that it's not official, but there is some kind of exchange of information and cooperation between Ukrainian journalists and Russian journalists. Belarusian, obviously, and it's great that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was there, because normally we don't speak a lot about problems in Belarus, and Belarus is one of the worst places in Europe. It's the authoritarian regime in Belarus is much worse than actually Putin is learning from Alexander Lukashenko. And I guess that it's really the question you asked, that's really important to support all those media in exile, because they, in a way, they are shaping post-Putinist Russia. We have no doubt that one day Putin is going to die. I have no doubt that the current war is going to continue till his death, because he doesn't have the idea to stop it while he's alive. And so don't be delusional. Let's not be naive. He doesn't want peace, but one day he dies. The situation can be different, because the importance of outer Russia is huge.
I just wanted to add one thing. I mean, I think we have to look at this challenge as an opportunity. So many of these exiled newsrooms are up and operating around the US and in Europe, not just focused on Russia and Ukraine and Belarus, but Iran, Afghanistan, other countries as well. They need a lot more resources. We also need to figure out how to use their incredible coverage of these places that we can't really access and inform Western audience as well. I mean, we have the technology to do very effective translation very quickly. So we shouldn't just be thinking about speaking back to their own audiences back in their home countries, thinking about how they can service our news needs as well. There's been massive investments in saving local media here in the United States. I think we need to think about how to massively invest in exiled journalists to save our coverage of the world.
Well, I'm glad to be able to end on a topic that speaks a little bit to the theme of resilience here in terms of moving forward, what can be done, and something of an optimistic perspective on keeping journalists doing their incredibly important work, even if they are exiled from the country. That's all we have time for today. Before we do wrap up, though, I'd really like to thank and acknowledge especially the Atlantic Council senior leadership who have made this possible. President and CEO Fred Kemp, also Executive Vice President Jenna, Ben-Yehuda, who we heard from before we took to the stage, and really importantly, Adrian Arsht, who makes this whole series of reporters at risk at the Council, of these important, vital conversations, really makes them possible, and I know is incredibly passionate about this subject and making sure that these conversations take place and are deeply constructive. So thanks so much for attending, and obviously if you have any other pressing questions you didn't want to make publicly, I'm going to volunteer the panel that are here to perhaps answer them in person. Thank you.